What happens when too big? Just sit on it, the rich rancher whispered to the young giant widow who was terrified of witness this unbelievable, true inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started. The Montana sky stretched endlessly above the Harper Ranch, painting the horizon in shades of amber and gold as the sun began its descent. Eleanor stood at the edge of the property, her tall frame casting a long shadow across the dusty ground. At 6 feet 3 inches, she had always been different, always towering over others, always feeling like she didn't quite belong anywhere. 6 months had passed since her husband died in a riding accident, leaving her alone with nothing but debts and a small piece of land that barely sustained her. The bank was closing in, the creditors were demanding payment, and Eleanor felt the walls of her world collapsing around her. She had come to the Harper Ranch as a last resort, responding to an advertisement for a housekeeper position that promised room, board, and a modest wage. James Harper was a man who commanded attention the moment he entered a room. Wealthy beyond measure, his ranch sprawled across thousands of acres, employing dozens of workers. At 45, he had built an empire from nothing, and his reputation was as vast as his land holdings. But wealth and success had not brought him companionship, and the massive ranch house felt emptier with each passing year. When Eleanor arrived for her interview, James opened the door himself. His eyes traveled upward to meet hers, and for the first time in years he found himself looking at a woman who stood nearly eye to eye with him. There was something magnificent about her presence, something that spoke of strength and resilience despite the fear he could see flickering in her gaze. "Mrs. Eleanor?" he asked, his voice deep and measured. She nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her worn handbag. "Yes, sir, I'm here about the position." He invited her inside, and as they walked through the grand entrance hall, Eleanor couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. The house was enormous, filled with fine furniture and expensive decorations. Everything about it screamed wealth and power, two things she had never possessed. During the interview, James noticed how Eleanor tried to make herself smaller, hunching her shoulders, keeping her eyes downcast. It was a defense mechanism he recognized, the behavior of someone who had been made to feel ashamed of who they were. "You can straighten up, Mrs. Eleanor," he said gently. "There's no need to diminish yourself here." She looked at him with surprise, her eyes reflecting years of hurt and rejection. Over the following weeks, Eleanor settled into her role at the ranch. She worked diligently, keeping the massive house immaculate, preparing meals, and managing the household staff. James watched her from a distance, noticing how she still tried to make herself invisible, how she avoided the curious stares of the ranch hands, how she ate her meals alone in the kitchen rather than joining others. One evening, James found her struggling with a large portrait that needed to be hung in the main hall. She was standing on a chair, but even with her height, she couldn't quite reach the hook on the high wall. The frame was heavy and ornate, and he could see her arms shaking with the effort of holding it up. "Mrs. Eleanor," he called out, approaching her, "that frame is too heavy for one person." "I can manage, sir," she replied, her voice tight with determination and something else, something that sounded like fear. "It's too big," he said, reaching up to help her. "Just sit on it." Eleanor froze at his words, her face draining of color. The phrase triggered a memory, a painful echo from her past. Her late husband had often mocked her height, making crude jokes and cruel comments. Those words, similar to what James had just said, had been part of his repertoire of humiliation. The portrait slipped from her hands, and James caught it just in time, setting it carefully against the wall. He turned to see Eleanor trembling, tears streaming down her face as she climbed down from the chair. "I apologize," she whispered. "I don't know what came over me." James studied her carefully, understanding dawning in his eyes. "What did I say that frightened you?" She shook her head, unable to speak, ashamed of her reaction. But James didn't push. Instead, he simply said, "Why don't we take a break? Come sit with me on the porch." Reluctantly, Eleanor followed him outside. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant colors. Finally, James spoke. "I've noticed how you carry yourself, Mrs. Eleanor. Like you're apologizing for taking up space in the world. May I ask why?" The kindness in his voice broke something loose inside her, and the words came tumbling out. She told him about her difficult childhood, always the tallest girl in school, always teased and excluded. She told him about her marriage to a man who had promised to love her, but instead spent years making her feel like a freak, like something to be ashamed of. "He would say things," she admitted quietly, "about my size, about how I was too much, too big, too everything. Those words you used about the portrait being too big, they just reminded me. James listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Eleanor," he said, using her first name for the first time, "look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his. "There is nothing wrong with you, nothing too big, nothing too much. You are exactly as you should be. Your husband was a small man, not in stature but in spirit, and he tried to make you small too because your magnificence threatened him." His words struck her like a physical blow, but this time it was the impact of truth, of validation she had never received. In the months that followed, James made it his quiet mission to help Eleanor reclaim her confidence. He insisted she dine with him at the main table. He introduced her to his business associates, not as his housekeeper, but as the manager of his household, a position of respect. He commissioned a wardrobe for her that fit properly and made her feel beautiful rather than awkward. Slowly, Eleanor began to change. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and stopped apologizing for her presence. The ranch hands noticed the transformation, speaking of her with respect rather than curiosity. And James found himself falling for the woman she was becoming, or rather, the woman she had always been beneath the layers of shame and fear. One evening, as they stood together watching the sunset, Eleanor turned to him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." James took her hand gently. "I only helped you remember who you've always been. Magnificent, strong, and worthy of taking up all the space you need in this world. This story reminds us that sometimes the greatest act of love is helping someone see their own worth." Eleanor's journey from fear to confidence wasn't about changing who she was, but about embracing her true self. And James's wealth wasn't measured in land or money, but in his capacity to recognize and nurture the beauty in another person's authentic self. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to Whisper of the Past, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from? Let us know.